Hello, welcome to a new installment of Singing with Peggy. I'm starting out in a little bit different camera angle because we're going to begin with another exercise that'll just be another resource for obtaining good body alignment. In our last session, we talked about the idea of resonance. What is a resonator, what is not? And the conclusion was, of course, that it is the vocal tract, but that it's important for all of the other elements of good singing to be efficient in order that our resonator, our vocal tract, is able to freely resonate the tones that we are making, and that our articulators can assist in finding the right resonating shape for the particular pitches and vowels that we're singing. I'm going to go back to kind of an old tried and true, maybe even a little bit trite alignment exercise that will also illustrate a point I'd like to make today about finding balance in our singing. So this is the old idea of the rag doll, which you flop and then usually roll back up. And I'm going to give you a method of really timing that rolling up that goes along with our thinking about our spinal column and how we want to have a nice tall, expanded torso, shoulders back, all of those things to get our hauser in order for singing. So if you remember the idea of choosing sides using a baseball bat with your hand over hand, we're going to use that as we roll up from the ragdoll position. So we're going to go from a position of trying to get relaxed, lose our tensions, and then roll back up into that creative, noble posture that is optimal for singing. So here we go. We're going to flop. You want to bend your knees a little bit. Let your head relax. Let my hair go all over the place. Then I'm going to start doing this hand over hand. When I get about to the waist level, I'm going to start rolling slowly back up, keeping my neck and head untensed, letting my shoulders roll back as I get to that point on my baseball bat. Slowly rolling back up. Nice alignment with my posture. So that particular exercise illustrates two states that we might want to think about when we're singing. One is completely relaxed. Of course, you can't be singing like this. So then we need to find a strong, muscular, energetic stance that will allow for good singing. We'll talk a little bit later, a little bit more about the idea of, I'm going to move the camera again, the idea of things being not black and white, because sometimes those are too extreme, but finding some nice balance in our singing. Now that we've got a nice aligned posture, all of those wonderful posture breath exercises that we've done, and we may later be coming back to the 1, 2, 3, 4 step program. Another way that you can work on trying to find some alignment within your neck and your head is through a humming exercise, and this is really kind of crazy, but I found that it works with a lot of my students. So I'm going to demonstrate it for you, and you can try it yourself and see what you think. I'm going to stop my ears, then I'm going to hum. And what you will hear in the video is not what I'm going to be hearing, obviously. But I'm going to then just gently move my head around in different positions. And at some point, I will hear a really strong, intense, buzzy hum. And then I will open my eyes, I will take my fingers out of my ears and see if that isn't a nice aligned head position, because we want a jaw that isn't tipped back. We don't want that necktie tenor, because you can obviously see that's going to put pressure on the larynx. It might actually stretch the vocal folds and help you feel like you are singing those higher pitches, but that's not the proper way to do it, obviously, nor do you want to have your chin down and depressed. So here's the humming exercise. That was the point at which I heard the most strong, intense hum. Even though my camera angle is a little bit below, I think you can see my chin's very level and my head's very straight, not tipped one way or the other. Many of us have a tendency to do a little head tipping as we sing, and I do too, so I have to watch that. All right. So we have demonstrated a little bit of 2 exercises to find good alignment, and also saw the contrast between maybe being too relaxed and being in a nice balanced state. So I'd like to talk a little bit about 2 vocal pedagogues, one from the last century and one who's very active in the current vocal science. William Bernard was a vocal pedagogue writer primarily in the 1970s. And in his books on singing and his articles, he would talk about hyperfunctional versus hypofunctional. Hyper being too much, extreme, on the overly strong side, while hypo would be under-energized, too relaxed, too lax. For example, if you're talking about your breathing, if you have a very rigid thorax, lots of sphincter action, your larynx gets really tight, you over inhale to expand the chest, your tone will feel kind of strained, smothered, throaty, throttled even. While a hypofunctional breathing would be, kind of what you might see in beginning singers, maybe shallow breathing with a lot of chest lifting, shoulder lifting, the lower ribs, epigastrium are not involved at all. And so your tone is going to be kind of weak. Along with that hypofunction in terms of taking the breath in, you'll probably have hypofunction in terms of your phonation. So you might not get full closure of the vocal folds in each cycle and have a very breathy tone. You might have the tendency to start or have your onset be breathy. Putting an H in front of words that start with a vowel, for example, you might sing, Amazing Grace. Also inserting H's into slurred notes, 2 notes together. You don't need to let that sound come out, which would be a hypofunctional form of singing. While on the other side, you also don't want a glottal attack, a harsh attack or onset, really heavy tension in the closure of the vocal folds, which will also reduce resonance. So you don't want Amazing Grace, that sort of singing either. Resonance also can be looked at from the 2 different sides, the black and white, rather being balanced, hyper versus hypofunction. So an example of a hyperfunctional resonating space, which will give you less resonance, might be a high larynx, a tense jaw, retracted mouth corners, and that will make your tone shallow, maybe white, maybe even non-vibrant, and the tone might be seemingly too open. Ah, not a pretty sound. While on the other side, and this may sound strange, but a nasal resonance that we talked about in the last session, which is the result of the soft palate, the velum being too low, is because you aren't activating those muscles to raise the palate, and so you will actually have a nasal tone is a hypofunctional tone. So you don't have a lot of energy. The tone will sound twangy and honky. It might also be dull and diffused, lacking in focus. Some other words sometimes like to have kind of a bite or a ping intensity. So we're going to get a tone that is kind of weak, and that might even be the opposite of the twang. You might just have, or my palate may be up a little bit, but everything else is under energized. So anytime the resonators are not really in tune with that fundamental frequency, you might have a hypofunctional sound where you're not getting the opening of the mouth. For example, if you're singing a higher pitch, oftentimes we need more of an opening, the jaw being lowered and the palate up to make a bigger or wider, sometimes resonating space. Another thing we'll talk about in another session is articulation, that is of the consonants. We haven't gotten there yet. And you might think of the hyper function is when you overdo your consonants. You don't want to go, that is the point, and putting that little extra vowel at the end of a consonant. But we also know that we can have hypofunction, which is failure to really pronounce the consonants, and so that they're very lacking. That is the point. Or having voiced consonants become unvoiced, as in, oh God, we need you. Oh God, we need you. Oh God, we need you. A little more in the middle, that balanced sound. The other person I mentioned, Scott McCoy, in his book, Your Voice, An Inside View, devotes the entire first chapter of his book and his vocal pedagogy program into talking about the idea of paired comparative words when you're describing the voice. While Vennard called these differences hyper and hypofunction, the way to perhaps describe vocal faults or maybe our vocal problems, and we did hear some problematic singing, that a continuum between two paired words might be just a way to describe different voices. Some of those descriptive words might be desirable. In fact, in some styles, a quality that we might not consider optimal in, say, one style might actually be what you want in another style. So he's taken away maybe the idea that there's desirable versus undesirable, although there are certain things that we don't want in any style of singing. So for example, he has the differentiation between bright and dark. Sometimes a very bright tone is exactly what we want. Sometimes a darker tone for particular coloring of the words, the text of a song. And some of our well-known singers, for example, he mentions that Placido Domingo has a darker voice, while Luciano Pavarotti was seen as having a brighter voice. And the Italian word is chiaroscuro, which is used in painting for the contrast between the light and the dark, especially in Baroque painting and classical painting. So in singing, we can think about that too, and perhaps the ideal is to always have a contrast and maybe something that's in the middle so that you balance not overly dark or overly bright, because on a continuum, we want to find a spot maybe in the middle. And Scott McCoy, in his use of these concepts creates a diagram where you can listen to singers and then you can rate them on these different qualities from bright and dark, which also might be determined by whether the tone is forward. Forward is brighter, back is going to be darker. Twang, which we talked about, that nasal tone, and then you can go too far in the other direction with loft, where your soft palate is overly lifted. You can actually go too far with that, and then you'll sound more like Julia Child with her very lifted, lofty kind of sound, which is something that you probably don't want in your singing, but somewhere in the middle, between the pressed and the breathy sound that we just talked about. Or you can have breathy, can even go as far as being raspy, that the vocal folds have just a little bit of opening and you hear the friction of the air going over the folds. We might have a contrast between vibrant, natural vibrato tone and a straight tone. And again, that could be a stylistic thing. Certain styles would prefer continuous, even vibrato, and others might want a straight tone, or a straight tone that when you sustain a note, the end of it might be vibrant. So that's very common in pop and some Broadway singing. But within the idea of vibrato, we could have more desirable forms of vibrato. Wobble is probably something that we really don't want. We hear about those older church ladies. I hate to put that on them because I'm an older church lady, but the tone does wobble. A little bit of that is age, and some of it is lack of, getting that really good breath management. But then there are some vibratos that are more fluttery, that are quicker, faster, and seem to move in a fast vibrancy pattern, while the wobble is probably a slow, as opposed to yeah, there was a little bit of a goat pattern in that too. So the idea of these continuums between two different descriptive words. When I started to say that Scott McCoy will have an exercise where you listen to singers, and then on a scale of 1 to 5, you can describe whether they are breathy versus pressed, dark versus bright. And probably the most desirable for really good singing before we get into style would be kind of right in the middle. Instead of a 1 or a 5, perhaps our preference is to be maybe a 3 or a 4. So, in order to deal with some of these issues that can be caused by tensions in the vocal tract, and now that we've done our little flopping exercise, our alignment exercise, let's talk a little bit about things that might interfere with our resonance. And one thing would be jaw tension, which is, pretty common. So one thing that we might want to do is just, be aware of the jaw hinge. So you've got that little flap at the front of your ears. So find the point right in front of that, and then maybe just gently find that hinge and release. I've got my piano here. Is that too close for comfort? So I can also play with coming up and making sure that my jaw is nice and free. What you don't want to do is say drop your jaw and then force the jaw down, so that we have just gravity kind of assisting and that we've released the jaw. We also want to be aware of too much jaw movement when we're singing. One thing that you can do to work on that is maybe just put a finger on your chin. This is not to press it and force it, but to be aware of when your jaw moves. An idea might be to sing a song that you're working on vowels only. I'm going to use the familiar Amazing Grace, and notice that it has quite a few slurred notes, and here's a place where the tendency to use your jaw to articulate might happen, and you want to avoid that. So, and I noticed that I had a tendency to close down a little bit on my E vowels, which might be a natural tendency, but to be especially aware of places like notice I didn't need to use my jaw to make the changes between the pitches. So that's something that you can play around with. Also, tendency that we have is to have a lot of tension in our tongues. One way that you can work on this, and this is something that might actually be bleeding over into your daily life, as well as jaw tension can. Some people may find that, they have bruxism, that you wake up in the morning with really soreness and tensity, that temporomandibular joint syndrome, or TMJ. And you could even perhaps get some help from your dentist to see if you are chewing and biting and grinding your teeth at night, and you can get a soft appliance that you can wear, kind of like a orthodontia retainer. I have worn those myself to prevent that in your sleep, as well as in your daily life. Stop and momentarily think, am I tensing? Is my jaw tight? I find when I'm driving, I have to be careful of that. And think about having little pillows or cushions between your back molars, so that rather than being your state of being, that it's more of a, with that little space. Then you can do some tongue jaw movements. These come from the Feldenkrais method. Moshe Feldenkrais was a gentleman who had his own physical ailments, and he worked with gentle breathing exercises, kind of like our 1, 2, 3, 4 method comes from Feldenkrais, and that you don't force anything, but that you use gentle, relaxing movements to deal with physical tensions. So one thing you can do is just lick the inside of your bottom lip and your top. Notice that the jaw kind of loosens up a little bit. A fun thing to do is to try to draw shapes in your cheeks with your tongue tip, like an O. The other side. Or if you're really talented, maybe you can write your initials. On either side. And my favorite thing to do just periodically is to place my tongue in the position behind the lower front teeth, and then just gently remind my jaw to go with the tongue. So those are some things that we can do to continue to work on those tensions that will restrict the vocal tract that we need for good resonance. One last little exercise takes our 7 steps. Remember that those steps are the floating skull, breathing in E, floating spinal column, breathing in Ah, floating thighs to unlock the knees on an oo, the NG, sniff breath, floating shoulders. Then we will do 1 moment, pause to lift the sternum. Then we vacuum out all our air and have that lovely plop for a breath. We are going to add to this that as you have your ploppy breath, that you think about the drop of the diaphragm the relaxation, the release of the abdominal wall and pelvic floor, that at the same time we can work on that posture. So as this drops, the jaw releases. And that as our lungs fill up with air, we can also think of the top of the roof of the mouth, the soft palate lifting like that, opening of the umbrella. So as we breathe, we're going to think of, and I'm going to make that motion to remind us of that. So we're going to do those steps, then we're going to add another step and then a third step. So this exercise is expanding in time. All right, so we'll start with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, plop. And as we plop, finding that tall posture of the inside of the mouth. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, suspend, vacuum air out, plop, exhale, inhale, with another lift of the soft palate and release of the jaw. Now we're going to do that whole process again, but when we get to the moment that we've inhaled, we're actually going to hold our breath, suspend the breath, try to keep the throat relaxed so that we're managing the breath in the lungs with the abdominal muscles, etc., and not holding it in our throat. So we are going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not sending any air out, not whispering. I will count by mouthing the words. So here we go again. We're just at the very end of that last step. We are going to add that 5 counts of just suspension. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, exhale and inhale. All right, final step on this exercise. When we get to, we've taken our inhalation, rather than hold it this time, we're going to do little micro pants. We're going to do 6 sets of 5, etc., for 5 times. And at the same time, be very aware that we're not going to collapse. We're not going to lose that wonderful creative posture as we do this. All right, let's give this a try. Blow out, plop. Exhale. Excellent. So you can work on this. Did you notice that all of this stayed nice and tall and high? And so we're keeping a relaxed throat. We're not letting our posture collapse, which will give us optimal resonating space. So finally for today, we're going to talk a little bit about something that